right, well, I expect the high schoolers to be able to answer all questions because they've heard some of these things before. I guess opening here, I apologize for my voice. I'm just getting over some strep or something, so we're still on the recovery end of that, but I've been on antibiotics, so I'm not contagious anymore, so we're still okay. Right, this morning we'll be covering Genesis 40 and 41. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're just going to review Genesis 40 really quickly and then get into the meat of chapter 41, because we do have to understand both of them together. But it's in chapter 41 where the motif of clothing becomes important to this particular narrative. So let me just open up in prayer. Then we'll begin just a review of chapter 40 and then hop into chapter 41. Father, we do thank you for your word. We thank you that you have made yourself known to us through it, that you, the eternal and highly exalted God of heaven, would lisp down to us and reveal everything we need to know for faith and for life. And we pray that we would be attentive to your word this morning, that we would listen well to it, come to know you through it, and live a life of faith because of it. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so we've been working our way through the Joseph narrative. We began back in Genesis 37, and we've been seeing how in every chapter there has been this key motif of clothing all along the way, that the different steps in Joseph's life have been marked by changes of clothes. And so it began in Genesis 37 when his brothers stripped off of him the coat of many colors, used it deceptively before their father Jacob, and sold him as a slave to the Ishmaelites, who then carried them down into Egypt. Genesis 38 was what seems to be an interruption in the narrative, but it's actually a parallel theme of clothing there, but this time with Judah and Tamar, where Tamar dresses deceptively to trick Judah into thinking she is a prostitute by her vocation by the side of the highway, and then wearing a veil to conceal her identity, and then uses his garments to present before Judah the reality of his own injustice against her. And so in Genesis 38, clothing was used in the opposite fashion of Genesis 37. Whereas in Genesis 37, it was for manipulation and injustice. In Genesis 38, it's deception unto justice. And then to make the contrast even more clear, in Genesis 39, Joseph is stripped of his clothes again, this time while living as a slave in Egypt in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar's wife, remember, consistently and persistently sought to have him lie with her. He regularly and always maintained his purity before it until one day she actually grabs his outer garment, strips it off of him, and he runs away, seeking to not sin against the Lord and against his master. And she, of course, lies about it, saying that he had tried to do so, which ends up placing Joseph in prison. And it's Joseph's place in prison, with now two episodes of him being stripped of his garments and being brought lower and lower, that we find him in the prison in Genesis chapter 40. And in Genesis 40, I'm sure you all remember what happens here. Pharaoh apparently got mad at a few of his officers in his court, specifically the cupbearer and the chief baker. And as he did, he threw them in prison with Joseph. And while there, the cupbearer and the baker each has a dream, right? So the cupbearer about the vine, and the baker about a basket of bread on his head. And Joseph was, while in prison, was yet able to make known the interpretation of the dream, that the cupbearer would be exalted back to his post, and the baker would lose his head rather than keep his head. And this narrative in Genesis 40 actually ties us back to Genesis 37. Because remember, in Genesis 37, even as Joseph was clothed in his coat of many colors, his status among his brothers was also revealed by what? By dreams. Two dreams in particular. Remember, the number two is very important for the Joseph narrative. where Joseph has two dreams that are going to exemplify his status over his brothers. And then he has two occasions where his clothing are stripped away from him, leading to further diminution, further humiliation, all the way down into prison. And now, as he's in prison, he interprets two dreams again of the baker and the cupbearer. And this is going to provide the occasion where he's going to interpret two dreams of Pharaoh, and then he's going to have two additional changes of clothing here in Genesis chapter 41, where he steps his way out of prison and then to a place second not to his father, but rather to Pharaoh in Egypt. And so that number of two has played an important role all along in the Joseph narrative. And as we've had two dreams showing his exaltation, two episodes of humiliation with this change of clothing, and now we have an additional two dreams from the cupbearer and the baker, and then two dreams from Pharaoh, followed by two changes of clothing. Joseph has found himself in prison. He makes known to the cupbearer that he is going to be exalted back to his office in Egypt, and he just asks of one thing from the cupbearer, that when he's exalted back into his office, he doesn't forget about the innocent Joseph who's been thrown into prison, even though he didn't do anything wrong. Well, what happens? Genesis 40, verse 23. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so here's Joseph lingering in prison for an even longer period of time. And now in Genesis 41, let me just read the first 8 verses and pay attention to how long Joseph has now been forgotten. Beginning of verse 1, after 2 whole years, 2 years, the cupbearer has let him languish in prison. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all of the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. I have dreamed a dream, right? Now when we have dreams in our own world, and we wake up the next morning, if we have weird dreams like this, maybe this is just me. My first thought is maybe I shouldn't have drank Dr. Pepper before going to bed, right? Or maybe not so much spicy food in my dinner the night before, or so on and so forth. And yes, I said Dr. Pepper on purpose because we're in Coke country here, but I'm from Texas, and that's Dr. Pepper's world. But this isn't the place of dreams in the ancient world. Remember, we're in a world where everyone believes in the supernatural in some sense. Now, they're polytheists, of course, but dreams have meaning to them. Dreams have an impact on their lives. They do believe that it is some way that the gods will be making things known to them. And so when Pharaoh has dreams of this nature, it's going to place him in a state of shock, right? Because he believes that dreams have some sort of bearing on their reality. It's not unlike how a lot of Islamic people interpret their dreams today. You've probably heard a number of stories, at least heard broadly from missionaries or the like, stories about how in the Islamic world a father might wake up, and because in their dream their son had offended them in some fashion, they actually punish them in real life because of something that happened in the dream, right? They have a direct impact between, or a direct connection between dreams and ordinary life. Well, this is quite common in the ancient world as well. And so when Pharaoh has these dreams that we read it and we might automatically attribute it to, you drank too much the night before, something like that. Pharaoh automatically thinks something else. His gut reaction is something's wrong in the world. I don't know what is happening. And it's particularly struggling for him because you've got these two dreams where, remember, you have the 7 plump cows and the 7 fat ears of grain. But then what happens to them? The opposite of expectation, right? Right, where you would think if you've got 7 things that are plump and fat, they would easily be able to dominate and bring to nothing other things that are thin and diminished. But the opposite of expectation is actually the case. The cows that are thin and diminished, and the ears of grain that are blighted by the east wind, consume the larger and what would presumably be the stronger. And so as he has these two dreams with the 7 and the 7, the expectations of reality are being flipped on their head. And he doesn't know what to make of it. He's struggling with trying to figure out how his dream is going to play into the reality of the kingdom of Egypt. And so he summons all of the magicians of Egypt and its wise men. Right? We know the magicians of Egypt. They show up in the book of Exodus. But we should understand this as something probably far more broad than just people going about doing hocus-pocus things. These were officers, diviners of Pharaoh's kingdom. In fact, in many occasions, these same quote-unquote magicians would have been something like a minister of state. They would have been function in an official capacity and dialoguing before kingdoms. And so these aren't just guys going around like Harry Potter with wands or something like that. They are actually of high status, of high authority, and high advisors in Pharaoh's kingdom. And he brings all of them before him. And notice at the end of verse 8, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Does this remind you of any other biblical narrative? It should. All right, so we've got Genesis 41, 1 through 8 with the two dreams. Any other non-Israelite king who has two dreams that he summons all the magicians and the enchanters and such before him, and none of them are able to interpret it except for one Israelite? Nebuchadnezzar, right in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, and again in Daniel chapter 4. Right, when Nebuchadnezzar has dreams, and he summons all of his wise men and everyone before him, and they utterly fail to be able to do anything except for Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel again in Daniel chapter 4. And so we've got Daniel, he's almost like a new Joseph-like figure. In fact, he's a new Joseph-like figure in more ways than one, because through the interpretation of the dreams, what happens to Daniel? He's exalted into what position? Second in Babylon. Right? Whereas Joseph is going to be exalted to second in Egypt. And so when we're reading the book of Daniel, I think we should be reading him in light of the Joseph narrative. He is a new Joseph-like figure. So at the end of verse 8, it's almost like there is no hope at all. There was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. He doesn't know what's going on. And placing yourself in his world, this is a freak-out moment. Until finally, when nobody else in Egypt is able to do anything at all to resolve the king's plight, notice verses 9 through 13. The chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Finally, after 2 whole years, a situation has arisen where the cupbearer is forced to recall the way he was drawn out of prison. And now this is an interesting thing. If I were the chief cupbearer, and I had a dream interpreted for me in prison that ended up being a reality, that'd be a pretty marked thing in my life, right? I don't think we're talking about someone who just walked off and it was like, oh, it escaped my mind, right? I think we're thinking of a person here who has purposely just disregarded the matter, right? And he's disregarded it because, in effect, if he comes out of prison, he automatically goes to Pharaoh and goes, hey, you know what? Someone in prison told me that I'm going to get my job back, and you should really go talk to this guy. What would that be? Well, he would ultimately be taking his moment away from himself and giving it to Joseph, right? That's the very thing that a worldly person doesn't want to do, isn't it? And so here, and even in the context where, placing yourself within the story, this would have probably been hours of, ministers and magicians and enchanters all coming before Pharaoh, and over again, they're failing to do it, and here's the chief cupbearer hanging off to the side, not saying anything the whole time. Until finally it's forced out, right? Finally he has to acknowledge the very thing that he has been seeking not to acknowledge for the last 2 years. So he comes before Pharaoh and says, you know what? I know a guy. He did it for me. Perhaps he can do it for you as well. And then beginning at verse 14, we begin to see the steps of Joseph's exaltation. Right? The steps of Joseph's exaltation, where he's first brought out of prison, changed out of his prison clothes and made presentable to Pharaoh, and then brought straight before him. So notice in verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And notice this interesting addition to the narrative. And we need to remember, nothing is in the Bible by accident, right? There's no tidbits of knowledge that are just there for fun, right? They have significance to them. And so verse 14 continues, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. What is this showing us? Well, how can you, if you were to be brought before one of the most powerful people in the ancient world, can you go dressed as a prisoner? No. Can you go all scraggly? Right? No. So they shave Joseph, they change him, and it's taking him a step out of imprisonment and back into a normal relation with people. His change of clothes and the shaving of his face is an initial phase of restoration. He's being exalted out of the pit, right, and being brought before Pharaoh in his court. Of course, Pharaoh addresses him. Verse 15, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph responds in a way that we would expect from him in terms of one that we've seen that has had a consistent piety in his life. Where he doesn't say, you know what, Pharaoh, I'm the man. I'm so wise and I'm so capable that if you just let it be known to me, I can parse this thing out for you. That's not what he says. He immediately gives the ability to God alone. It is not in me. But then he continues, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Now, favorable answer, we need to think about what that might mean here. It doesn't mean that God is going to tell Pharaoh whatever he wants to hear. It's actually an idiom in Hebrew that means that God is able to give Pharaoh an answer to his question. All right, so God is able to make known the interpretation of the dream. And the interpretation might be positive or negative. Right? The idiom doesn't lean us in either way there. And this is consistent with with Joseph's own actions, because back in chapter 40, and chapter 40 verse 8, he actually says something very similar to the chief cupbearer and to the baker, where they said to him, we have had dreams and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. God is the revealer of mysteries, and he's able to make known the otherwise enigmatic, right? Things that none of the other diviners, none of the other magicians, none of the other counselors could ever think to make known. God is able to make known through his servant Joseph. And he does. So Pharaoh reveals his dream to Pharaoh. So the next couple of verses are really a summary of the dream. So I don't want to reread the summary to you through verse 24. But then notice what happens beginning in verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be exceedingly severe." And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, if I heard someone tell me a dream about 7 cows and 7 other thin cows and getting eaten with one another, I wouldn't give this interpretation. I don't know about you. But nonetheless, Joseph, who's being used by God, is able to give a divine interpretation for what he is making known. And the Lord is using this particular scenario in order to exalt Joseph to a position of authority in Egypt. Ultimately, we learn later on in Genesis to do what? To preserve his people. In fact, the famine is going to be so severe that it's not just going to be in the land of Egypt. It's going to be throughout the entirety of the known world. And through God's preserving of Joseph and through God's exaltation of Joseph, he's going to care for the entire community of his people, the family of Jacob. God is at work, kind of behind the scenes of the things that are happening here, to exalt Joseph from his humble status as a prisoner so that he might be a servant to the entire people of God. And so through Joseph, God makes known to Pharaoh the things that are about to happen. And this is where we get to an important point in the narrative, not just about the historical event of 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, but also the importance in the narrative of the number 2. Right? We've had pairs showing up over and over again throughout the Joseph narrative. And notice in verse 32, the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. We've had a doubling of things every step along the way in the Joseph narrative. And so what does verse 32 tell us about the broader events in Joseph's life? Well, that these are things fixed by God. That God is governing everything all along the way. Right? Joseph had 2 changes of clothing bring him down into prison. That was fixed and ordained by God. Joseph had 2 dreams himself about his brothers bowing down to him. That was a thing, fixed and ordained by God. And now Joseph is undergoing the progressive exaltation out of prison in 2 phases. Another thing, fixed and ordained by God, that is ultimately going to bring about the condition necessary for Joseph's first 2 dreams. Right? His dreams about his brothers bowing down to him, which, remember, that has not yet happened in the narrative. There's a thing fixed by God. And Joseph, even as he has undergone an extended time of humiliation at the hand of his brothers, at the hands of Potiphar, and even spending a number of years in prison at this point, knows that God is the one who ordains and controls all things. Now, I hope that we would be so orthodox in our own thinking and in our own times of struggles as well. This was no a week or 2 here or there are having a hard time. In fact, later on in Genesis 41, we learn that Joseph is 30 years old when he's exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh. And remember how old he was in Genesis 37. He was 17. So it means 13 years. 13 years, a little bit more than a decade of servitude in Egypt. And at least a minimum of 2 years, I'm not entirely sure how long he was there before the cupbearer and the baker were placed there, but at least 2 years plus however long before that in prison. And yet throughout this 13-year period of time, more than a decade, Joseph has been trusting and resting in the Lord, and the Lord has been with him all along the way. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, isn't it? God has not abandoned Joseph in the times of his humility and his struggle and his hardship. He's been with him throughout the entirety of it. And indeed, by the end of this narrative, we learn that Joseph begins to recognize why the Lord has been with him. And it has not been for his ill. It has been for his good, as God works all things for the final good of his people, even if, in the meantime, it doesn't always feel that way. So here's Joseph. After 13 years of slavery and imprisonment, like 13 years putting those two things together, being brought before Pharaoh, having his garments changed, and now being brought for restoration. But then Joseph does an interesting thing. Joseph had been asked to do what? Interpret the dreams. And there's a sense where his work is over at the end of verse 32. Right? He had interpreted the dreams. He made known. He has done what he has been told to do. But remember from back in Genesis 39, we know that Joseph is not just faithful to the Lord. From Genesis 40, not just that he is able to interpret dreams, but we also know from those chapters that Joseph is also wise. He's a wise administrator of Potiphar's house, and he's been a wise servant even as he's been in prison and placed over the charge of the entire prison, which I don't know of another context where you would put a prisoner in charge of prisoners. That's pretty weird. But now Joseph steps in after he has done what he has been asked to do by Pharaoh and his servants, and he applies the wisdom that the Lord has given him to this situation. And it begins in verse 33. So after interpreting the dream, verse 33, he continues, "Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man." Now notice he doesn't name himself, but it's a perfect description of Joseph. "A wise and discerning man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers of the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish throughout the famine." So now Joseph applies his wisdom and discernment to this particular scenario that God has made known through him. So he tells Pharaoh what he should do is place one individual over the territory of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty, so that they could take 20% of all the produce of the land and store it up in grain houses. That way, whenever the years of famine come, they would not perish. And we struggle to figure out, to reckon with what famines would be like in the ancient world. See, if we have a bad crop here in the States, you know what we do? We import it from Ukraine. And I mean that. We really do. Right? Or from other countries all around the world, we import these crops. And so we've got kind of a worldwide market that when one place is having a bad year, other places are able to kind of stable it out so that there's not nearly as much famine as there would have been. But in the ancient world, a famine of this magnitude would actually depopulate entire cities. So we've actually discovered a number of occasions in the ancient world where there's entire depopulations of cities where, it's built up, a famine or maybe disease or something comes through the town, and then all of a sudden it's completely uninhabited. These would have been, kingdom-destroying things to reckon with. They don't have the ability to go down to Walmart or Costco and, grab a 50-pound bag of grain and be able to wait it out for the next couple of weeks until things, level out. It's not that way in the ancient world. And so when you have an extended period of famine, you're pretty much guaranteed that thousands of people are going to die. Cities are going to be left uninhabited and in ruins. But here, Joseph gives a way for that what seems to be a foregone conclusion, for Egypt to escape that foregone conclusion, to be preserved throughout these years of famine that would otherwise lead them to utter dismay. And it's here Joseph's application of his discernment and wisdom to the scenario that leads to his final exaltation. Notice verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" Now that's an interesting phrase in and of itself. Now I don't think we should then interpret that Pharaoh has all of a sudden become a monotheist. Remember, he's a polytheist, and so he's probably reflecting upon that in his own worldview. But I say that because that's nearly identical to what Nebuchadnezzar says of Daniel in Daniel chapter 4. Right, when he summons Daniel into his court and it says, "Daniel, in you is the Spirit of the Holy God." Right, so it's reckoning with the reality that the God of Joseph is making things known. He is with Joseph. And just as Potiphar recognized it in chapter 39, so now Pharaoh recognizes it in chapter 41. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regard the throne will I be greater to you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh. Without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom, discernment of Joseph, and the reality that God is with him. And because of that, what does he do? He changes his clothes again, doesn't he? Now remember, we have two phases of humiliation with two stripping off of Joseph's clothes. Now we have two phases of exaltation with the putting on of Joseph's clothes. And it's interesting if we compare this narrative with the other narratives. Right? When Joseph's brothers strip off his coat of many colors and he's sold into slavery in Egypt, what does he put on? Doesn't tell us, does it? When Joseph is stripped of his cloak in Potiphar's house and he's placed into prison, what does he put on? It doesn't tell us, does it? But now, when we're on the other side of the coin here with Joseph's exaltation, it omits what he takes off and it tells us what he puts on. Right? He puts on clothes appropriate for him to be brought before Pharaoh, and now he's being clothed as a king. Right? In fact, he has Pharaoh's own signet ring placed upon his hand. He has royal robes placed upon his body and a golden chain placed around his neck. And he rides in a chariot where they cry out, "Bow the knee." Remember his dream back in Genesis 37? That his brothers would be bowing down before him. And there were two dreams. And so the thing is certain. And now here, as God has been with Joseph all along the way throughout his humility, now God is bringing Joseph up to the status and the place that he needs to be in order to preserve the broader family. For the next 7 years, Joseph is now going to gather in the grain stores of Egypt. In fact, he's going to gather so much grain that verse 49 tells us he ceased to measure it, for it could not be counted. Now, they would actually build fairly large grain storage facilities in ancient Egypt. And here he would have whole storehouse cities that are built. And they gathered so much grain during the years of Egypt's plenty that it was immeasurable. So much grain that we could, I guess, describe them as like Scrooge McDuck. Right? Remember Scrooge McDuck where he had his massive, vault with all of his gold coins, and to go around swimming in his gold and things. Well, it's like that, but with grain. You just go swim in this stuff. You don't even need to count it because you are so wonderfully wealthy. God has provided for Joseph, and through Joseph, he is providing for all of Egypt, and ultimately, as the chapters proceed, for all of his brothers as well. Interestingly, Pharaoh renames and weds Joseph. In terms of the wedding, that would have been a fairly common thing for servants of Pharaoh to be wed off to someone of the court of Egypt. But he renames Joseph, an interesting name here, Zaphanath Paneah. The name means God speaks and lives. God speaks and lives. And I mention that as an interesting name because that's exactly what has happened in the narrative, isn't it? God has spoken what would happen in the next 14 years of their life, and because of that, life is going to be the result for the people of Israel. In the meantime, Joseph, now wed to a priestess of Egypt, has two children, Manasseh and Ephraim. And their names match this part of Joseph's life. Manasseh, notice in verse 51, Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Manasseh literally means no bitterness. I can imagine that in those 13 years of humiliation, that Joseph had some hard feelings towards his brothers. I know I would. But now, at the end of it, as he is looking back, Joseph begins to have those things resolved. No bitterness, he says. For God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. I think the idea being that the bitterness of soul that he had for his brothers has now been removed in God's providential dealings. And then he names the second of his sons Ephraim. And the reason he gives is, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And Ephraim actually means to be fruitful. It comes from a term that means an ear of corn, right, or grain. And so as Joseph has now been exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh, placed second in charge of over all the territory of Egypt, the bitterness of soul that he had towards his brothers is done away with. And in the time of his affliction, God has made him fruitful. Ephraim is the result of his life. And if you know the way that the Bible proceeds towards the end of Genesis and into Exodus, Joseph, in light of his fidelity to the Lord, in light of his faithfulness throughout even this hardship and this time in his life, he gets a double portion of the inheritance. Where Joseph doesn't gain one tribe in Israel, he gains two. And so his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, are both going to be promoted to the tribal level. Right? They both become tribes in the territory of Israel, where all of the other brothers only have one. So he is quite literally fruitful in that sense as well. The fruitfulness of the land that he's naming Ephraim after here corresponds to a fruitfulness of progeny. And remember the patriarchal promises. The promises given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob is that he would make their descendants great. And here Joseph is a particular recipient of that blessing, where his children are going to be promoted to the tribal level in a way that the other brothers do not receive in terms of the blessings from their father. Towards the end of Genesis 41, and I'll just summarize where the narrative is going to go after this, and we'll have some time for questions. We find the end of the 7 years of plenty. And so if we're putting this on the broader map, this has been 20 years since Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers, right? The 13 years of slavery and imprisonment, now the 7 years of plenty, and now those 7 years of plenty are over. And so in the course of one chapter, we have 7 years of history going on and entering into the next 7 as well. We need to remember when we read the Bible, it's often the case that you read one sentence and all of a sudden a decade has passed. That's just how it's going to go. Verse 53. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come, and as Joseph had said. there was famine, and hear this, in all the lands, right, all over the world, all the lands are in famine. But in all the land of Egypt, there is bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened the storehouses. And then listen to this. This gets into the wisdom of Joseph and I guess maybe a political shrewdness that we can appreciate but not always be a fan of. And sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. What do you do? Well, he imposed a 20% tax on all the produce of the 7 years of plenty, right, storing it up in the storehouses, and then he sells what was taxed back to them. You know, who's going to get super wealthy off of this? Pharaoh. Right, Pharaoh is going to love Joseph. Right, this is actually going to present a context. Why is Pharaoh going to be so favorable to Joseph and to his family later on in the book of Genesis? Well, because an event that would have otherwise likely led to the demise of his reign and perhaps even the loss of his kingdom has actually led to his enrichment. Right? Pharaoh is becoming more powerful and more wealthy through Joseph's actions, and it leads to a context where, at least for a period of time, the people of Egypt are going to be very favorable to Joseph and to the people that come with him. That's why Pharaoh is sending Joseph back to get his father. That's why they'll allow him to go back to bury him at the end of the book of Genesis. That's why they're given an entire land, the land of Goshen, as their own within the territory of Egypt, because through Joseph's work, Pharaoh's getting a pretty posh life. And in fact, later on, when the Egyptians, right, and imagine this, the entire country of Egypt runs out of money from buying the grain. It's all going into Pharaoh's coffers. So what do? They sell their land to Pharaoh. This is a consolidation of power. Right? Through these acts, Pharaoh is gaining more and more financial status. He's gaining more and more control over the territory of Egypt. He is a happy guy. Until a couple hundred years later, when the people of Israel look like they might outnumber the Egyptians, they're going to get mad about it and try to kill them all. Right? But that's another story for a couple centuries in the future. But here, through Joseph's wisdom, there's an enrichment of Pharaoh himself, and even later on into later chapters, a consolidation of power around the throne of Pharaoh, and an event that would have otherwise surely led to Egypt's demise. But here, Egypt is preserved through a famine. They gain power. And I mentioned, the consolidation of power under Pharaoh. Just imagine a context where in a broader ancient world, everybody else is starving, but Egypt is doing fine. What does that mean in terms of international politics? Right, who's got the power? Egypt does. And they're able to use that as influence among the broader world as well. And so Joseph plays a central role in preserving for his brothers, and even in the context that is going to pave the way to fulfill the words of Genesis 15, where the nation of Israel is going to reside, or the people of Israel are going to reside in a land that is not their own for a number of centuries. Until towards the end of that, they are going to be humiliated and brought low, much like how Joseph was, made servants in Egypt. But the Lord is going to do what? To bring his people out of that and exalt them, not to status in Egypt, but to his own people at his own mountain, under his rule, rather than under the rule of Pharaoh. Joseph's life, in many ways, is actually a microscopic version of what's going to happen with all of Israel later on. He's sold as a slave in Egypt, later on exalted into status among the people, but eventually restored to his family. Well, all of Israel is going to be going down into Egypt. They will, for a time, have exalted status there, but then they will be brought into servitude until the Lord exalts them back to himself and places them under his rule rather than under the rule of Pharaoh. And the Lord will be with his people. He will attend to them even in the time of their exile, or in the time of their sojourning in the land that is not their own. But the Lord is at work in a more narrow way with Joseph here as well, to preserve his brothers and the family from their own death. And the way this happens with them is actually an interesting thing. We only got a few minutes to mention it, and we're not going to come back to the Joseph narrative because we don't have time for the course. But you know how the story goes. Joseph's brothers run out of food, but they know there's grain in Egypt, so Jacob sends them to Egypt to get some grain. While there, Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. They get some food. They go. They leave. He says, don't come back without Benjamin. Right? Eventually, they come back with Benjamin, and he places a test before them to see whether or not they are going to maintain their relationship as brothers or whether their same sort of pettiness from earlier on in his life will be the case. And so he places the money in Benjamin's sack, goes, finds them, confronts them for it, and then in Genesis 47, he makes the grand reveal of what has been going on all along with himself. And he makes himself known, Genesis 45, to his brothers. And as he makes himself known to his brothers and they finally learn that Joseph is alive, he actually symbolizes his restoration to his family in an interesting way. We're in Genesis 45, verse 21. Joseph gave to them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh and gave them provisions for the journey. And then hear this in verse 22. To each of them he gave a change of clothes. What did they take from him that kicked this whole thing off? His clothes. The very thing that marked the disunity among the brothers is now the expression of unity. Where they stripped him of the coat of many colors, now Joseph, restoring the relationship with his other 11 brothers, now clothes them. They stripped him of his clothes, but now he clothes them. And then Benjamin, he gives 5 changes of clothes, showing the closer fellowship he has with his full brother. And then notice repeatedly throughout this section, he charges them. Notice the end of verse 24, do not quarrel along the way. Right? The disunity of the brothers expressed through the stripping of clothes, now the unity of the brothers expressed through the granting of clothes and the charge. Do not quarrel. Be the family that the Lord has set you apart to be. And so throughout Joseph's life, from beginning and even to the end in the restoration with his brothers, it has been traced along this motif of clothing. 2 acts of diminution, 2 acts of exaltation, and now 1 act of reunification. While being stripped of his clothes and having that long period of disunity with his brothers, even a time of bitterness of soul. At the end of it, through the Lord's providential protection of Joseph, provision for Joseph and for the rest of the family, ultimately the end is restoration. And while stripped of his garments from his brothers, he then provides them clothing to show their unity once again. All right, we got a few minutes left for questions. I meant to pause along the way, but that's a long chapter, so there's a lot of stuff to talk about. All right, any quick questions as we got about a minute or 2 left? Yeah, John.
Well, I was kind of struck by something you pointed out in the lesson that, we're so familiar with the arc of Joseph's story, but Joseph left.
Right.
And in chapter 41, when he expresses confidence to Pharaoh about how God speaks through dreams, there was really no empirical basis for that confidence because the dreams that he had had
Hadn't come to fruition yet.
and seemed so completely unlikely to be fulfilled because he was a subject instead of being bowed to,
Yeah.
and he was geographically separated from his family.
Yeah.
The likelihood that his parent and his brothers would bow to him was completely off base.
Yeah.
And yet such was his faith that he could express to Pharaoh his confidence.
Yeah, you've had 2 dreams, and so we know that it is certain. Which means it's certain for him too, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we have to tune ourselves to doing better with whenever we're reading the Bible is not jump the gun, right? If you've been a Christian for a while, you've probably read the narratives multiple times, and so your mind automatically fills in where everything is going. But there's times when we need to pause along the way and just think about how are things happening right now and what's going on with this particular character in the story. Otherwise, we're like, everything's going to go well for Joseph, and we miss the fact that he's been suffering for 13 years. This would have been, he's not in a good phase in his life. That would have been hard, right? And we forget that if we just automatically know how things are going to go. Right? We got to step into the story a little bit better and pay attention to where these things are going. Let me close in prayer, and we can go downstairs and get whatever's left over from the teenagers. Father, we thank you that you are a God who makes yourself known. You made yourself known to Joseph in these dreams, and you make yourself known to us in your word. And so we ask that we would listen to your word, that we would trust how you have made yourself known to us, that we would not seek a revelation from another way, but to go to it in the way that you have chosen to for us in this age. And Lord, we thank you that through the Joseph narrative we see that you are with your people, even in the context of humility, even in the context of struggles, and even times where we might experience our own bitterness of soul. But you are the one who preserves, protects, and keeps your people even through the hardships, and who will bring your people to exaltation, if not in this life, then in the life to come, giving us the hope of heavenly glory, and to know that there will be a day when all bitterness will be wiped away, all fruitfulness will be seen, and we will be fully restored unto you. Lord, give us this hope of faith, that even if in a time we may not feel it or experience it in our lives, we would know that it is true, because you have made it known to us not one time, not even two times, but many times throughout your word. And these things are certain because you, our faithful God, cannot lie. We ask that you would give us all of this in the name of Christ. Amen.